Welcome to this hands-on video about constructors. In this video I'll deal with the problem that we've come across in the previous version, DrawingApp 1.3. So I'm going to continue where we left off in the previous version 1.3, and there were two problems we were faced with. The first problem is that relatively a lot of code is needed by the client just to create and initialize an object, 5 lines in our case. I'm executing that for a first instance here and down below. So always 5 lines. The second problem we face is whenever I create an instance of a rectangle and print out the current state without setting any initial values. So I just want to print out the default values. Well, if I run this code, we note that the current values of the height and the width are 0. That are the default values. And this is actually invalid state because these values are not allowed according to the specifications. The acceptable values must lie between 10 and 500. How do we solve both problems? Well, by implementing constructors in the rectangle class. And this is what this hands-on video is all about. Okay, before starting, I'll create necessary packages. So first in the lib class, right-click, new package, dm04 constructors, enter. And the same in the app. Then copy the necessary files. So the rectangle class, right-click, copy or Control-C, right-click, paste or Control-V. And do the same for the DrawingApp. Copy and paste. Just have a look at the DrawingApp to make sure that I'm importing the correct class, not the rectangle class from demo version 3, but demo version 4. Okay. Then I'm going to clean up a little bit, just delete some codes. Run the code, and so we're using a new version. I don't click on this one because it's going to execute the previous version, demo 3, but on one of these triangles. And so the output we are going to concentrate on is the printout of the first rectangle, this one, and then the printout of the second one, which results in this output. Okay, let's first tackle the problem with the 5 lines. What I want to do is actually be able to pass all these values, 10 for x, 20 for y, 100 for height, and 200 for width, directly on one line. So let's do that. Let's try this. 10, 20, 100, and 200. And I don't want to call those settings individually. Apparently I can't do that. I get a compiler error. I hover over this error and he says expected 0 arguments but found 4. What is the problem? Well, whenever we want to create an instance of a class, what we need is a constructor. Now, we never had any problems creating instances because there were constructors created automatically, default constructors. I'll say more about that later. But this time I want to create an instance with 4 arguments. The compiler doesn't know what we mean, and that's why it creates a compiler error. How do we solve this? Well, by creating a constructor in the rectangle class. IntelliJ already proposes to do that, but I'm going to do that manually. So I go to the rectangle class. I'll add a comment block for the constructors. Let's implement the constructor. What is a constructor? It is like a method. So in our case, it'll be public. Otherwise, the client will not be able to create an instance of this class. And what is the name of the method? Well, the same name as the name of the class. No type specification, so no int or void, nothing. What do we want the client to be able to do? Pass 4 arguments. First argument represents the x coordinates. Second argument, the y. Third argument is the height. And the fourth argument is the width. The client wishes to pass 4 arguments. The x coordinates, the y coordinates, the width, and the height. Now, what do we want to do with these values? Well, initialize the properties. Assign the value of the parameters to the individual properties. So this dot x is x, this dot y is y, this dot height is height, and this dot width is width. For now, this is enough. There still seems to be a problem, one related problem, and we actually see that the problem is occurring in the app. The problem is that he cannot create the second instance anymore. Whereas before implementing our constructor, there was no problem in creating an instance with no arguments. Now all of a sudden there is a problem. What is a compiler error? Expected 4 arguments but found 0. What is a problem? Well, as long as we don't implement a constructor explicitly, and before starting this topic about constructor, this one didn't exist. What happens then? The compiler will then automatically create code that represents a constructor with 0 parameters, enabling us to create instances without having to pass any arguments. That constructor is called the default constructor. So whenever you don't create a constructor yourself explicitly, the compiler will automatically create this default constructor. Now from the moment you do create a constructor explicitly, so I'll uncomment this, then the compiler doesn't create this default constructor anymore. The only available constructors then are the ones that you have implemented explicitly. In our case, only this one. And then the only way any client will be possible to create an instance is by specifying 4 arguments. That's why we don't have a problem with rect1 anymore. That one compiles, but we have a problem with rect2, since the default constructor is no longer available. So before being able to run this code, we need to tackle this problem. Well, in our case, we want a default constructor to be available, but the constructor must make sure that the object will be in a valid state. So x and y may be 0, but height and width may not be 0. Let's give them then the minimum value of 10. Let's add the default constructor explicitly. So public, it's a constructor, so no return type specification, void or int or whatever, nothing, just the name of the class. No parameters. We call this a default constructor. Let's copy paste some code. These 4 lines. Let's give some initial values. 0, 0. What is the minimum height specification? It is 10. What is the minimum width specification? 10 as well. Okay. Now just these 2 lines are not really necessary because the default value of instance member variables of type int is 0. So we may as well delete those 2 lines. So what remains is a default constructor that will initialize our object and set the height and width to 10. Now, since I don't like the use of this here, I'm going to replace these values by finals. Final int min height is 10. Final int min width is 10 as well. And replace the values. It makes the code more readable. Back to the client and run the code. The first object and the second object is initialized with default values for x and y, but with valid values for height and width, unlike the previous version. Okay, those 2 constructors solve actually our 2 problems. Now we can pass lots of arguments while creating an instance of a class. We don't have to call these setters explicitly after the instantiation. The second problem, having an initial object in an invalid state, namely height and width were 0, is now solved by adding the default constructor, which will automatically provide default values for height and width. Let's see what happens whenever we pass invalid values to the constructor. So let's pass a value of -100 for the heights and run the code. What do we see in the output? Oh no, height -100. the problem we were faced with during the session about encapsulation and validation. What is going on? We have our setters. If I go to the setter of the height, here we have implemented a setter guaranteeing us that whatever value is passed as height, that if it is accepted, it'll be between 10 and 500. So my object will always be in a correct state. But that is only if I call the setters. In this case, I'm not calling the setters, because what is happening here? New rectangle will automatically invoke the 4 arguments constructor. That happens automatically. From there, he'll jump to, and now I do a control left mouse click, and he'll jump automatically to the constructor. How is this implemented? No validation is occurring. Nothing. What we should do in order to solve the problem is that instead of assigning the value of the parameter directly to the property, it's called the setter instead. So these 4 lines, I'm going to keep them for now so we can compare with the new code, have to be changed by calling the setters. So set x, x, set y, y, set height, height, and set width. And do the same in the default constructor. So copy paste of the 2 setters and pass the minimum height and the minimum width. Okay, so we make this a validating constructor. Okay, let's run the code again. So this value of -100 should not be accepted. Let's see what happens. What is the output? There is an error message, invalid height -100. This is because from the client we jump to the constructor. We call the setter for x, the setter for y, the setter for height. So control mouse click is what I always do. Control key mouse click. Whenever we arrive in the setter, the value is -100. Else we have the error message. And the height is not changed. The default value is 0, so that one is untouched. So then, after coming back from the set height, we're back in the constructor, we execute set width with a value of 200. Okay, that works fine. And back to the client. We print out, and we have this line. Rectangle rect1 with a height of 0 is in an invalid state. How to deal with it? Well, let's go back to the set height. There are 2 approaches. So one approach would be to do the following. Whenever the value is not within an acceptable range, we print out the error message and we assign a default value of min height. If I run the code again, this time we see that the object is in a valid state with a default value of height 10. The client passed -100, cannot be accepted, so we provide a default value. That is one approach. So if the value is not correct, we provide a default value. But that will create a problem that if we call the setter directly, suppose that afterwards we call the setter directly and we pass it once the value of 100, and then the second time we pass the value of -200. What will the value be then when I print a line? Run the code. We see value of 10. So the last height that was set correctly was 100, but it has been overridden by this default. If I go back to the setter of the height, well, we just said, okay, the value is not accepted because I passed a value of -200. Okay, then we set it to the minimum. That's a bit of a strange behavior. So in our current situation, there's no ideal solution. Or it works fine whenever we pass an invalid value with a constructor and then we get a default value. But whenever the object is already created and we pass an invalid value via the setter, then the correct value that was set earlier is overridden. For now, we have to choose whatever implementation is best, and we go for the fact that passing an invalid value with the setter doesn't change anything. So we cannot accept the statement that I just added. Okay, so I'm gonna remove it. How is all this solved? By using exception handling. So here again, we would throw an exception to notify the client, any client, the error message will be received by the client and he has to deal with it. Here we'll detect a problem and print out an error message. We'll do it in the client app, not anymore in a rectangle class. A graphical user interface, a desktop application or mobile app could throw up a message box or a message in the status bar displaying that the value is incorrect. That is the approach we're going to choose. So where are we so far? We've got our constructors and we converted them to validating constructors. So we call the setters within the constructors. Let's suppose that now the client wants to create another instance, but this time x and y may be 0, but he wants to pass initial values for height and width. So basically what he wants to do is the following. Rectangle rect3 is new rectangle with default values height and width 300 and 400. We get a compiler error. Before looking at the compiler error, let's try to figure out what the problem will be. We know that whenever we pass arguments to a constructor, well, that constructor with the same amount and type of parameters must exist in the class. Now for now we have two constructors, one with 4 parameters of type int and one default constructor without any parameters. Now this time we want to pass 2 arguments of type int. Does that constructor exist in rectangle class? No, that's why he gives the compiler error. Let's have a look at the error. Cannot resolve constructor rectangle int int. He's looking for a constructor with 2 parameters of type int. If we want the client to be able to do this, we have to add that constructor. So let's do that. I'll copy paste this constructor. Paste. This time it is a 2 arguments constructor. We will only accept a value for height and a value for width. So this can go. That can go. Save. This is my 2 argument constructor. And the problem is solved. Let's print out the instance. Run the codes. I'll put this set height in comments and I'll pass a correct value this time because I don't want to see any error messages appearing. Run the codes. This is the first instance, this is the second instance, and this is the third instance. X, Y, 0 and 300 and 400 for height and width. Suppose that the client wants to create a copy of an existing object. We have created object 3, well, we want to create a copy. So rectangle, rect4 is new rectangle. We want to create a copy of rect3. Here again, there is a compiler error because the compiler is looking for a constructor with 1 parameter, which already we don't have, and of type, not an int anymore, but the type of rect3, which is rectangle. We passing in a reference to an existing object, being the third object, being this one. And indeed, the error says cannot resolve constructor rectangle with as parameter rectangle. So let's create that one. Let's go to the rectangle class, and I'll implement it between the default constructor and the constructor with 2 arguments. And the idea is the following. I define constructors with increasing number of parameters. On top, default constructor, no parameters, then 2, and then below 4. The constructor I want to define now contains 1 parameter, so I'm going to implement it here. And I'm going to copy paste some code for that. Copy and paste right here. Make sure you use the correct one of version 4. Rects. Delete these lines. And so what it needs to do is set the properties x, y, height, width using the properties of the object that this reference variable is referring to. So rects dots. I could use getX or just x. X being a little bit quicker because with the getter, well, this is an invocation of a method. It's more processing time because a stack frame has to be set up. This pointer needs to be initialized and so forth. So using this one is a bit quicker. And do the same for the others. Rect.y, rect.height, and rect.width. This constructor initializes a new object by copying the properties of an existing object to those of this new object. And we call this constructor the copy constructor. Okay. Let's go back to the clients and print out rect4. It's out rect4. Run the code. Now I expect the last two lines to be the same, and indeed. So we have rect1, rect2, rect3, and rect4. The copy constructor. This for the implementation of constructors so far. Because we're not done yet, it's time to optimize. It's time to refactor the implementations we currently have. Optimize what? Well, we have some redundant codes in the constructors. Let's have a look. Well, we started with implementing this constructor before parameters, and what it's doing, it's calling 4 setters. Then the other constructor is using 2 setters, 4 setters, and 2 setters. This code is too redundant. This can be optimized. How this is done will I demonstrate in the next version when I talk about chaining constructors. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.